Hey folks, so today we're going to consider clothing and how it relates to our identity and how we can practice with that. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in helping to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. So I had a recent question here. It's actually a two-part question. I'll deal with the first part of that question today, and the second part perhaps next week or later on. And the question is from Kez B, and he asks, he's interested in the application of Buddhist principles to clothing. So he asks, aren't robes that must be a specific color and style a form of clinging? That is, to rites and rituals, to self-identity, and so on. And he's asking about Buddhist monastics in particular, because as we know, Buddhist monastics traditionally wear various kinds of robes. In the Theravada tradition, they wear saffron robes or sort of orangey brown robes. That comes from the early tradition back in the Pali Canon. They're discussed as being sort of a saffron color. In other Buddhist traditions, they wear other color robes, which is kind of interesting. The Tibetan tradition tends to wear sort of a more purple-red type of robe. In certain aspects of East Asian Buddhism, they'll wear black or they'll wear gray. I know actually when I was in graduate school, I studied with a nun who was from Taiwan, and she wore a gray robe and had a shaved head. So I know that there's different traditions, even within Buddhism, about what kind of robes you wear. But nevertheless, Kez is asking an important question. So to what extent are these kinds of robes, are these kinds of clothing, is that an example of clinging, or of self-identifying a certain way, or of setting yourself up as somehow different? And to what extent is an example of what's called rites and rituals? Now, we should remember that within the early Buddhism, one of the things that the Buddha recommends against, or recommends we watch out for, is not to cling to rites and rituals. So, for example, if we think that doing a certain ritual or keeping a certain even ethical compact is going to, by itself, lead us to awakening, that's false. And that's what the Buddha is saying. What he's saying is that whatever rites or rituals we keep, they're not going to be what's absolutely important to attain awakening. To attain awakening, what we need to do is to overcome our self-identity view. We need to understand the sort of egoless nature of ourselves and of the world. We need to relax around clinging and craving for things to be certain ways or not to be certain ways. Those are the central kinds of aspects of practice. But rites and rituals can also be clung to. They can be the sorts of things that we consider part of ourselves, that we identify with in certain ways. For example, let's take monastic robes. Now, of course, monastic robes are a signal of a certain kind of thing. They're a signal of a certain status within society. They're a signal of a certain separateness that the monastics are supposed to have from the lay community. And this is a signal both to the monastics themselves. In other words, it's supposed to be a kind of a reminder of the vows that they took when they became monastics. But they're also supposed to be indicators, marks for people who are non-monastics. In other words, they're not supposed to simply be marks within the community, but also if a monk when a monk goes into the lay community to beg for alms, which is how traditionally they would be fed. Traditionally, they would be fed because they would take their begging bowl out to the lay community, and the lay community would give them food. To the extent that the lay community wanted to. And if for some reason the lay community was not happy, then the lay community would not necessarily support the monks. And then they would have to find some other business. Without that mark of being a monastic, by wearing the robe and having the shaved head and everything, that was a mark to the lay community that, okay, this is a monastic, this is somebody to whom one can give alms. That grew up in a certain context of ancient India, wherein there was a certain segment of society who were renunciants in one way or another. They had renounced ordinary society, and they had gone, let's say, into the forest to practice. They would sometimes be naked. They would sometimes have hair shirts. They would sometimes be dressed up as, let's say, animals of certain kinds. There is any number, probably an unbounded number of different ways that one could dress oneself up and indicate to the broader society that you were a renunciant. But basically, you were dressing up in a different way from the way that ordinary people would dress. Now, when it came to settled orders, such as the Buddhist order, there was a way that you were supposed to dress to show yourself as a member of that order. Basically, you were showing that you were kind of, let's say, professional. You were a professional monastic. You were a professional renunciant, and that you should be treated as such, and so that there wasn't going to be any confusion, which is normal. It would be normal for there to be confusion if somebody wasn't dressed a certain way. But having said that, let's reflect a little deeper and realize that no matter what we wear, we're wearing a kind of uniform. We're wearing a kind of signal to the broader society about the way we are, about the way we want ourselves to be perceived. And that is something that is not, the reason, I'll put it this way, the reason that we look at monastics as different, as separate, as somehow unusual in the clothing they wear, is simply because they're not ordinary in our society. On the other hand, what is ordinary, let's say, is somebody wearing a suit and tie when they go into work, whereas in other cultures, that would be very unusual. And so when we see somebody with a suit and tie, we don't automatically think, here is somebody who is wearing a kind of a uniform that signals a certain thing to people around him to which he could cling, whereas we're likely to think of it in terms of monastics. Of course, we all know of people within Western communities who wear literal uniforms, where they're uniform in the sense that they're literally the same, such as policemen or firemen or people working in certain kinds of service industries. But we have to understand that no matter what you wear, even if it's not really literally a uniform, it is a kind of uniform. So for example, we can think of people who reject society in certain ways, such as the punk community. They'll wear, let's say, black leather, they'll wear spikes, they may wear spiked hair, but that is itself a kind of a uniform. It's uniform in certain ways, in the kinds of colors, in the kinds of signals that it gives. We all know when we see somebody wearing that kind of clothing, we know what they're supposed to be saying. It has a certain signification within our culture. The same if somebody is, let's say, a hipster or a hippie. We know what these different clothing styles say. And we're all inclined to think that our own clothing style it doesn't say anything particular. Or at least many of us may think that. We may think, oh, all these people are wearing strange clothes, but me, I wear just the normal things. But that's only because we're blind to our own position within society sometimes. And we're blind to the way we wear clothing. So for example, the clothing I'm wearing right now is very clearly, I think, maybe you can tell me, but clearly to me, an example of a kind of a casual Western clothing style. And casual may sound like it's the opposite of uniform, but it's not. Casual has its own rules. Certainly within Western culture, it has its own rules. And if you go outside of, let's say, the United States and wear something quote-unquote casual, other people may look at it as being strange, as being the sort of thing that sets you out as American. I know that, for instance, if you go on airplanes, if you go on airplane journeys now, oftentimes the Americans will be the ones who are dressed in pajamas, they'll be dressed in sweatpants, they'll be dressed in t-shirts, they'll carry a pillow with them sometimes. And this is the sort of thing that in certain aspects of traditional culture around the world, that would be looked on as very strange. Now, the Western response is that they're trying to be comfortable, but from the point of view of a different culture, comfort is let's say, less important than respectability or respect. And what oftentimes, or I wouldn't say often, but certainly is the possibility of happening, is that someone from a different culture could consider that kind of clothing disrespectful in some way. That it disrespects the people around them because it's too casual. It's the sort of thing that you would wear in your own bedroom, but not the sort of thing that you would expect to wear out in public. To take an example from my own life, when I started going to regular talks over at my local Sangha in New York, I was wearing a very casual kind of outfit. I would wear, a t-shirt and sweatpants because to me that was the most comfortable way to do meditation. And we would always tend to do meditation in these kinds of periods. And I remember that one day, after, let's say, several weeks of wearing this kind of outfit or uniform, my teacher said, oh, it looks like you've just rolled out of bed. I don't know that he meant anything particularly bad about that. I think he was just making a point, or at least noticing something. But to me, I understood that that was a way of saying that it was somewhat, or at least it could be taken as saying it was somewhat disrespectful, that it didn't take the seriousness of the topic into consideration. And again, I don't think he would have cared if I had come in that way or continue to come in that way. But to me, I changed the way I dressed up now to go to these classes. Now, I mean, still, if I was going to go to a day-long or a retreat, I might wear something more casual. But for something shorter, something a little bit more, let's say, a formalized teaching of some kind, now I dress up more. So there's examples of where we can be blind to the way that our own clothing reflects our identity or how we self-identify. And again, simply by self-identifying as someone who considers comfort above all else, we're making a kind of point about individualism, which is very important within American culture. But individualism is itself a kind of self-identity. Going back to the original question, any of these can become forms of conceit or forms of clinging. They can become the kinds of things that we either cling to or reject. We might cling to them in ourselves. We may think that we are that a particular way of dressing is sort of the only way to dress or the best way to dress. We may be aversive to them in others. We may react with disgust about some clothing that somebody else is wearing. That was certainly part of the intention, I think, behind a certain amount of, let's say, countercultural clothing. The punk style, let's just take one example. It was supposed to be a rejection of contemporary clothing style, a rejection of contemporary society, a kind of a reaction against it, a kind of aversion to it. And it was a signal that the person wearing this clothing had that aversion, was aversive to the normal society. And so all of this kind of, whatever we wear, can become a form of conceit. If we remember from early Buddhism, conceit comes in three flavors. We can be conceited in thinking that we're better than other people. We can be conceited in thinking that we're worse than other people. Or we can be conceited in thinking that we're equal to other people. And this may be an unusual way of thinking. I have an earlier video about that if you're interested in hearing more. But I think we can understand that when it comes to clothing. And in particular, obviously, the first type, that we think that our clothing is better than the people around us. There certainly is always a possibility of that happening. Clothing is a kind of a ritual, is a kind of a rite or ritual that we undergo, all of us in our various ways. And it can be an object of practice. In fact, it should be an object of practice if we have any kind of daily kind of Buddhist-related practice, or even a Stoic practice, or any kind of, I think, even Greek practice. Because within early Greece, there was also the idea of clothing being an issue that we could cling to. So for instance, if we take the early Cynics, Diogenes, who had lived in a barrel, I believe lived naked. It was the same kind of thing that we saw in ancient Greece that we saw in ancient India. The same kind of rejection within a certain aspect of society of traditional ways of living. Now, of course, the early Buddhists didn't go around naked. In fact, they were supposed not to do that, but they certainly, in wearing what they wore, they were setting themselves apart. That always has the possibility to lead to a mind of clinging or conceit. And in fact, in a very famous passage of the Dhammapada, the Buddha says that whoever is defiled and devoid of self-control and truth, yet wears the saffron robe, is unworthy of the saffron robe. And the point there being that it's the practice, it's the ethical practice, it's the psychological practice, it's the kind of understanding of these things that are what is important, and not the wearing of the robe. The robe is supposed to be, if anything, an indicator of the potential of that awareness, of the potential of that wisdom. But they don't necessarily go together. And there are many passages in early Buddhism that say that just because you wear a robe doesn't necessarily mean anything. And there are plenty of bad people wearing robes. But of course, that goes for any clothing style we want to wear. There are plenty of bad people wearing casual clothing. There are plenty of bad people wearing suits and ties. We all know that. I think if we want to put a practice of clothing into our repertoire, then we might want to at least spend time considering and meditating upon the role of clothing in our life, how clinging we are to it, how much we think that our clothing is better than that of other people, how much we think that the clothing of other people is worse than us. That is, how judgmental we are about clothing. Or, I think, how invested we are in a notion that we're all equal in terms of our clothing. Because that's also a form of comparison. And I think along all these lines, it might be interesting to consider, at least in your mind, of how you would feel in different clothing. Whether that might be how you would feel in a monastic robe, how you would feel in a uniform of the various kinds, how you would feel in the traditional clothing of a different culture. And I expect you would feel very uncomfortable, because you would say, this is and it wouldn't necessarily, and the discomfort, importantly, would not necessarily have anything to do with whether the clothing itself was comfortable. The clothing might be perfectly comfortable. In fact, my expectation is, and not having tried it myself, that Buddhist robes are probably very comfortable. But we would probably not be comfortable about the signal that it would give to the broader society. We might say to ourselves, by wearing this clothing, I am setting myself off as something that I'm not. And that would probably be the thing that would make us uncomfortable. I would just guess. But consider it and put it down below. I'd be interested in your thoughts about these questions, because I think this is one of an infinite number of ways that we can practice with the objects in our daily life. These are physical objects that have a lot wrapped up in our identity with them, and that working on all these different aspects can, I think, come together in a more rounded and wiser life. And of course, if we're able to understand that people who wear different clothing aren't doing it out of conceit that we don't have, but rather that we're all coming from our own place of having our own different kind of conceit, as it might be. And so that if we can see other people in that light, then I think we can come also with a modicum of kindness to them, to people who are different from us, to people who wear clothing different from us. And of course, by relaxing around issues of wearing the right kind of clothing, relaxing around our comparing mind, we're also helping ourselves to be a little bit less stressed. So I think all these things work together, and if we put them into practice, we'll find ourselves in a better place. So I hope that's been useful, and thanks so much for your comments and questions. Again, put any ones you have down below. I'd love to read them. I'm sure everyone else would too. Check out my Patreon page if you're interested in getting a little bit further into these topics and helping us out. And we will catch you on the next one of these videos. So thanks a lot, and be well.